I'm Tom Jensen, the founder of Entrepreneur Futures, a 20-year-old national nonprofit whose mission is to empower the next generation of great innovators and entrepreneurs with education, training, and mentoring. Massive research and development investments in new technology from the private and public sectors are necessary to meet our nation's goal of achieving a carbon pollution-free power sector by 2035 and net zero greenhouse gas emissions by no later than 2050. Our federal government must play the leading role in these investments, especially for early-stage new technologies. Without this scale of public investment, many new and critical technologies will never see the light of day.
For almost 10 years now with raising a lot of SBIR grants. And we've also gotten some grants from SATO and the DOE. And so it's been very useful to write those grants. The great thing about grants is they're non-dilutive.
Our nation's people expect, and federal and state funders are committed to using these R&D funds as appropriately and efficiently as possible. Meeting this expectations begins with rigorous budgeting requirements and processes for R&D grant applications. In this session, I will give a primer on U.S. Department of Energy grant budgeting, including structuring the budget, aligning your budget with your scope of work, deciding on fringe and indirect rates, cost share requirements and strategies, and of course, federal match funding from states and other sources. I'm a former global practice director and vice president at SAIC, a Fortune 500 company. I've advised more than 100 companies on applying for federal and state R&D funding. And I have 8 years of experience assisting state agencies evaluating more than 150 grant applications. Of course, I'm not a DOE budgeting or contracting officer, but I have this experience, as I've described, from the perspective of advising a number of awardees. So what I'm going to try to do in this session is share some tips and tricks that I've learned and help demystify the budget process for you. In terms of starting, my recommendation is starting with a Gantt chart or a similar representation in Excel to define where it is you're trying to get at the end of the project and what milestones and tasks are needed to achieve that. Next, you would write out your statement of project objectives consistent with that Gantt chart. The SOPO is comprised of a narrative and tables. The SOPO milestone tables are central to this document. You should build your budget around that statement of project objectives. Make sure you have enough money available in the project to achieve those objectives. And that's a really big tip.
Budget appropriately, get the dollars that you need. Don't cheap out, don't pinch just because you're getting pushed by the reviewer to optimize your budget. You need to put the proper amount of money in there for every person on the team, including yourself. You need project managers. You need those different people. They have to be in the organization, and you have to raise enough funds to have them on the team. If you don't do that, you're just going to struggle, and it's going to be really uncomfortable.
So let's look at an example of one of these budget justification forms. As you can see, it's an Excel document, and you can download it from the EER Exchange. The example I'm going to show you, however, in this session is a fully populated one based on a past DOE awardee that was funded. So we're going to begin on the Instructions and Summary tab, which is exactly that. For any of the tabs, you want to read the instructions carefully. We'll walk through some of the high points in our review today. All the cells in the Summary tab except the white ones self-populate from other tabs. It's only these white ones that you need to fill in with your budget period dates. Please note that in the budget summary section, the first few rows with numbers show the total budget broken down by budget period. It's typical for DOE awards to have more than one budget period, although that's not always the case. Usually, budget periods might be 12 months long, and you might have 3 of them, or they could be 18 months long. Therefore, you might have 2 of them. And that's the case in the example here, where you have 2 budget periods. And as you can see, we have a column showing the total cost of the award, and that is the sum of the federal contribution. That's the amount being provided by the DOE in that budget period. Your cost share minimums will vary depending on the funding opportunity and which topic your organization applies for. The spreadsheet automatically calculates the cost share in each budget period. In this example is for a project that required a 20% cost share. So these total costs in this summary tab are split into cost categories, including personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, etc. Each cost category has its own tab, beginning at tab A and ending at tab J, cost share. So let's go ahead and look at each of these tabs. Again, you don't need to fill in anything from this tab except for the white cells. All the other information will be automatically pulled from each of these other tabs. So let's go ahead and start with the Personnel tab. What you need to do on this tab is to list who will be working on the project. You don't need to list them by name, but you can list them by position or category. You need to specify how many hours in the budget period they will be working and what their pay rate is. And this spreadsheet will calculate what you're going to pay them. An important consideration is if you already employ a person who's going to be working on a project, you need to put in their present pay rate. You're not allowed to pay them something different in this project than what their salary is. If you're going to be hiring someone new, then whatever their pay rate is has to be consistent with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, rates for that category of worker. Therefore, you can't use exorbitantly high or low numbers. The DOE will review these rates carefully and help make any corrections if needed in contract negotiations. I'm going to ignore the first column, the SOPO task number, but I will come back to this before we wrap up talking about the spreadsheet. I want to point out, if your budget period is not 12 months, but it's something like 18 months, make sure you remember that as you're inputting that number of hours, it may be different. That is because instead of using 2,000 hours for someone who's full-time, it might be something like 3,000 hours because it will be for a year and a half. So let's talk about the Fringe Benefits tab. In addition to the personnel costs, you should have fringe benefits, also sometimes called employee-related expenses for each of these employees. And in fact, if I remember correctly, this tab pulls from the Personnel tab. So if you input a person or category in the Personnel tab, that person or category will magically appear in this tab. And then you simply need to assign them what their fringe rate is. Now, in doing that, you have 2 choices. And you can see these choices at the bottom of this tab. Choice 1, if you're a company that has already had awards with the government, you may already have a negotiated fringe benefit rate. If that's the case, you would check the first box, include your rate agreement in your proposal, and use these numbers on this tab. Or if you're a startup company or have not worked with the government before, you'll probably be checking the other box. So in this case, when you submit your application, you'll submit a proposal to the DOE for a fringe rate. You want to base this rate on your company operations history if you have one. Whether you are a new company or not, you should explain your basis for that rate in that proposal and summarize it in the space for the explanation at the bottom of this tab. Again, the DOE will carefully review this before you are awarded a contract. These rates can't be, crazy high, crazy low. I can't tell you what this rate should be, but I know from experience with several clients that they are often in the 30% range for a startup company. And depending on what kind of benefits you have, they may well be lower or higher. So let's talk about the travel tab. You will have some travel on your project. To complete this tab, you need to list each place you expect to go during the project, where you're going from, the number of traveler days, etc., the purpose of the trip. You want to do your best to estimate the cost of travel. Don't just make up numbers. For the airfare, you should check them on one or more websites such as Google Flights. For lodging and daily per diem, which includes meals, you must use the federal government's rates published by the General Services Administration. You can go to their website. These rates will vary by location. You should look up these rates to calculate what these numbers should be and input them in this tab. The GSA does not publish rates for rental cars or for flights or other transit costs. The DOE understands that, of course, some of the destinations and other travel details will change even before you start your project or during the project. But try to think through where you want to go and for what purpose, and do your best to arrive at a total travel budget that you can live with, that you feel comfortable with during your overall project. So let's talk about equipment. As you can see in this tab, equipment includes items more than $5,000. If you're selected for contract negotiations, you'll have to submit quotes for any equipment over $50,000. So one way of thinking about the difference between supplies and equipment is equipment are for items above $5,000, and you'll see in a minute supplies are for items below $5,000. Something to note about equipment is if you are awarded a contract, you have to pay back some of that funding for equipment at the end of the project. And the way that you would do that is you would look at the depreciated value of that equipment and the market for that equipment at the end of the project. Arriving at that number may be a challenge. You'll have to provide the DOE with a proposal at the end of the project, and you'd have to agree with them in terms of what you would pay back. A tip is if you have other sources of funding that you don't need as match funds, like investor funds or revenue, I encourage you to consider using those funds for equipment and focusing your project funds on other things. Therefore, you won't need to go through this payback process. Something else to note is even if you propose to purchase equipment with cost share, the same restrictions and payback process applies. So let's talk about supplies. Supplies and materials are usually items less than $5,000 each. Having your statement of project objectives or SOPO drafted before you do this estimate will help you come up with your costs for these supplies. As you can see in this example, the company did a really thorough job listing the supplies that it anticipated to use to meet its objectives in this project. Supplies may include computer software or nuts or bolts or electronics, chemicals, etc. Make your best estimates based on previous purchases or quotes you received from suppliers. Let's talk about contractual. Contractual is one of the more important tabs. You may have one or more sub-recipients, also known as subcontractors, or maybe even your company is a subcontractor on one of these proposals. And you may have consultants or service providers who are categorized in this spreadsheet as vendors. You need to put these items in the contractual tab. Entering the consultant or vendor costs is relatively straightforward. You're just inputting their total amounts per budget period. Entering the data for subrecipients is more complicated than for vendors who typically receive less funding. This is because if a subrecipient total funding exceeds 25% of the total budget, or more than $250,000, they have to fill out their own budget justification form. So the subrecipient forms would be nested under yours in your final submittal. Therefore, the bottom line numbers per budget period go into the higher level ones shown in the Summary tab. Let's talk about construction. Not everybody will have construction costs, but construction is defined as all types of work done on a particular building or site, including erecting, altering, or remodeling. Any construction work that is performed by a vendor or subrecipient should be entered under tab F, Contractual. You should list all proposed construction in this tab, providing a basis of costs such as engineering estimates or quotes, prior construction costs, and at the bottom of this tab, briefly justify its need as it applies to the statement of project objectives. So let's talk about other direct costs. Fairly straightforward. Items that you might include in this tab: costs for both shared user facilities such as testing or prototyping facilities. So in this example, this was the draft budget for a startup company that was using these types of facilities at a local university. Let's talk about indirect costs. Sometimes people refer to indirect costs as overhead costs. Your overhead is perhaps the largest or the only component of your company's indirect costs. You may, however, have a separate general administrative or G&A expense category. And like the fringe benefits tab, you have two options. Either you already have a negotiated indirect rate with the federal government, or you have to check the other option. And if you check the other option, then you would typically take the so-called de minimis indirect rate, which is 10%. So in this tab, you would put an overhead rate of 10%. If you check the rate agreement, then you input what you think your actual indirect rate is, especially if you have some operations history at your company. For example, rental costs, insurance costs, other costs that contribute to overhead. Then you would go through the process of negotiating that indirect rate and getting it approved by the federal government before your contract is signed. However, for most startups, this rate may only be 10% unless you go through this process to negotiate a different rate. So let's talk about cost share.
One of the largest challenges here is your company has to have cost share available to commit, and that cost share cannot be other federal grants. And so that means there's likely needs to be some investment in your company previously, or you want some business plan competition.
Most of these funding opportunities will require cost share. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned is whether all these other tabs should be inclusive of the cost share amounts, or whether it should only be the cost share that goes in this tab. And the answer is, it's the former. And cost share costs from all the tabs where cost share applies, equipment, supplies, contractual, should be included, meaning all the money that's planned to be spent on the project. This includes both the part that the DOE is paying and your cost share that you will contribute. Then in the cost share tab, you call out these items that were in these other tabs that are being paid for by your company as cost share. So it's not that the tabs A through I get added to tab J. It's whatever is listed in J is already included in A through I. You can see in this tab, the example company is contributing $66,000 in each budget periods 1 and 2. It turns out in this case, the subcontractor is providing cost share, but is not receiving any money on this project, and that's fine. Their costs are shown in the contractual tab, but they are repeated in the cost share tab. A very important thing and tip is if you have a subcontractor who's receiving substantial funds or a big chunk of the budget, you should probably ask them when you are negotiating their teaming agreement to contribute an appropriate amount of cost share, so it's not all on your company. But if that company goes out of business, or for some reason you have to drop them from the project, the DOE will hold the prime recipient, your company, responsible for the entire cost share amount. You can't use other federal grants or awards as cost share. That's important to note. Vendors and consultants can't provide cost share, but subcontractors can. And your cost share will be reviewed in detail and is subject to all the same rules and restrictions as the DOE funds on the project. That takes us to the end of the tabs. I was going to revisit the first column for many of the tabs, that is the Statement of Project Objectives, or SOPO reference. As you can see on the Personnel tab here, what happens is, as you make your Statement of Project Objectives, you'll have it broken down by task. Some tasks may be relatively inexpensive, such as setting up a detailed measurement verification plan, while others, such as design and prototyping, may represent the bulk of the project. So in these tabs, the DOE asks you to associate expenses with your specific tasks from your SOPO, and that's what this is. I recommend that you do this step last after your SOPO is finalized. The final thing I want to point out is after you've gone through all of these tabs and everything is calculating properly, you should come back to the Instructions and Summary tab. The sum of all the costs in your tab should appear here, and the sum of whatever you've listed a second time as cost share in tab J is what's going to appear in the Summary cost share column. And then the difference between these two is what's calculated here as the federal government's amount, the amount that you would get from the DOE in this case. I know that was a lot of detail. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Let me review the key things I'd like you to remember from this session. First, in your budget, you are specifying your federal funding and cost share by budget period. And you decide, at least at the proposal stage, what the budget periods are. Your application and budget is your best estimate at the proposal stage. If your proposal is selected for funding, you will go through the process of renegotiating your statement objectives and budget with the government. You must use current rates, don't forget that, for existing employees, and reasonable justified rates for new ones. As you'll recall, you have the two different choices for fringe and indirect rates. The first option is that you'll use rates you previously negotiated with the government. The second option is you'll submit rate proposals for each in your application. Remember that you have to pay back some of the equipment costs to the DOE if you use either their funds or cost share funds to pay for equipment. Keep in mind that cost share includes cash or in-kind contributions, and the minimum cost share required will vary depending on the funding opportunity. Coming up with your cost share is challenging. Don't forget to ask your major subrecipients and partners to contribute. Also, don't forget that the prime recipient, it may be you, is legally responsible for paying the entire cost share. Finally, make sure that you carefully plan ahead for your writing schedule, starting early, and leave ample time for internal reviewers throughout the preparation process. My hope is that this session has helped demystify the budgeting process by giving you a solid framework and insightful tips. Wherever you are in your journey as an innovator or entrepreneur, the goal of EFN and our partners is that you get the support and resources you need to succeed.